In 1980, Frank Zane competed at the Mr. Olympia contest held at the Sydney Opera House before 2,000 spectators, a CBS television crew, and the most competitive lineup the sport had ever seen. The outcome of that night reshaped professional bodybuilding, and depending on who you ask, it stands as either the greatest comeback in the sport's history or a decision that should never have stood. Zane entered that contest as the reigning Mr. Olympia champion, having won 3 consecutive titles. Among those who followed the sport closely, he was regarded as the standard against which all other physiques were measured. When the results were announced, he finished 3rd. He walked off the stage holding a trophy that had come apart in his hands and left the building without public comment. He believed the outcome was wrong. He still does. Now 83 years old, Zane has spoken in fuller detail about what surrounded that contest, the weeks leading up to it, what took place backstage, a confrontational pre-contest meeting, and his assessment of a result that CBS television declined to broadcast, citing concerns that the competition had not been decided fairly. To understand what was at stake for Zane in 1980, it's necessary to consider where he stood going into that year. He had won in 1977, 78, and 79, each title built on increasingly refined conditioning. By 1979, he described himself as being in the best shape of his life, under 200 pounds on stage, with a 29-inch waist and a degree of symmetry and definition he had spent 2 decades developing. A 4th consecutive Olympia title would have placed him in a category few athletes in the sport had reached. During contest preparation, Zane was sitting in a poolside chair that gave way. He fell against the edge of the pool and suffered a urethral injury that required a prolonged hospital stay. By his own account, he would complete a set in the gym and then check to make sure he wasn't bleeding again. Over the course of his recovery, he lost 15 pounds of muscle. Weeks of preparation were lost. His physical condition, the foundation of his career, had deteriorated to the point where he was uncertain whether he was ready to compete at all. Frank Zane was uncertain whether to compete. Physically compromised and unsure of his condition, he did what he had done before every other Olympia. He called Arnold Schwarzenegger. Zane posed for him, showed him where he stood physically, and asked for an honest assessment. Arnold told him to go to Sydney. He said Zane could still win. What Zane did not know, and what almost no one knew at the time, was that Arnold had already begun preparing his own return to competition. He had started training, he was organizing his entry. When Arnold looked at the condition of the reigning champion and told him to get on a plane, he may well have seen in that assessment exactly the information he needed to believe he could win. Frank Zane flew to Australia. He did not know what he was walking into. The 1980 Mr. Olympia was positioned as a significant moment for the sport. For the first time in its history, the competition was leaving the United States. It would be held at the Sydney Opera House in Australia. CBS television had paid substantially for broadcast rights, a deal covering 3 years of Olympia coverage. The event represented bodybuilding's first serious move toward mainstream international legitimacy. The promoter was Paul Graham, an Australian entrepreneur who had bid to host the competition. Graham had money, connections, and a genuine interest in the sport. He also had a close personal friendship with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And beyond promoting the contest, Graham was simultaneously producing a documentary about Arnold's return to competition, a film he had already titled The Comeback. The man running the event had a documented financial and professional interest in a specific competitor winning it before the competition had begun. The judging panel presented further problems. Of the 7 judges assigned to score the contest, 4 had documented personal ties to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Reg Park, a former champion and one of Arnold's closest mentors, was among them. So was Albert Busek, the man who had helped Arnold enter the American bodybuilding world in the 1960s. These were not neutral evaluators. They were figures from Arnold's personal and professional circle placed in scoring authority over a contest he was entering. Then, hours before the event began, veteran judge Peter McCarthy was removed from the panel. The circumstances were described at the time only as curious, and no full explanation was ever provided. His replacement was a judge whose credentials had been revoked 2 months earlier for bad judging. The panel that would determine the 1980 Mr. Olympia had lost one of its most experienced members and replaced him with someone whose license had recently been pulled for incompetence, hours before the contest in an event being promoted by a close associate of one of the competitors. The competitors did not know this. The public did not know this. The full picture would not come into focus until after the results had been decided. The day of the contest began with a standard competitors meeting at the Sydney Opera House. Judges, officials, and athletes in the same room to review format, schedule, and rules. What took place at that meeting was not standard. Word had been quietly spreading among a handful of insiders since the night before. Bill Pearl, the legendary bodybuilder scheduled to serve as head judge, had called Boyer Coe in his hotel room with a message that unsettled the competitor camp. Pearl told Coe that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to enter the contest, not spectate, not commentate for CBS, but compete. After 5 years of retirement, beginning that morning, when competitors and officials gathered, the announcement was made official. Arnold Schwarzenegger was entering the 1980 Mr. Olympia 24 hours before most of the world would find out. The room erupted. These men had spent a year, some of them several years, building and sculpting their bodies for this single moment. They had sacrificed relationships, careers, social lives, and physical health to arrive in peak condition on this specific day. And now, hours before they were to walk on stage, they were being told that a retired 6-time champion, who had spent the last 5 years pursuing a Hollywood career, had decided to enter the competition. Arnold also used that pre-contest meeting to push for a change in format. He wanted the competition run as a single open class, no under 200-pound division, no weight categories, just one group judged together. Several competitors objected immediately. The most forceful and articulate objection came from Mike Mensa. Mensa had built his training philosophy and his entire identity in the sport on the conviction that merit was everything, that results should follow from effort, discipline, and scientific rigor. He said exactly what he thought, directly and without apology. Arnold did not respond well to being challenged. The exchange escalated quickly. Arnold directed a pointed remark at Mensa's physique, telling him he hadn't won the year before because his waist was too large, and that the same would be true this year. It was calculated and personal. Mensa lunged at him. In front of nearly 50 athletes and officials, with the biggest bodybuilding competition in the world hours away, two of the sport's most celebrated competitors nearly came to blows inside the Sydney Opera House. Bill Pearl and several other officials stepped in to separate them. Frank Zane witnessed all of it. Standing in that room, injured, depleted, and now fully aware of the environment he was walking into, he understood the situation was far removed from anything resembling a fair competition. In his own account, written years later, he described the stress of that atmosphere, how it showed on his face, how tired and drawn he looked, how he knew he was not at his absolute best, and how that made it harder to carry himself with the confidence of a champion. When Arnold's name was announced as the winner of the 1980 Mr. Olympia, approximately 40% of the 2,000 people packed into the Sydney Opera House began booing. It was not polite disagreement. It was loud, sustained, and cascading, rising from the main floor and washing down from the balconies, the kind of response a crowd produces when it believes the outcome was wrong. Arnold took the microphone anyway. Standing on stage with the Sandow Trophy, he told the audience that the result proved, once and for all, that he was the greatest bodybuilder of all time. The booing reportedly lasted for a full minute. Frank Zane, watching from the wings, had one thought. The audience had good taste. Chris Dickerson jumped off the stage the moment his second-place finish was announced, audibly saying he couldn't believe it. Roger Walker, the Australian competitor who had finished 6th, described Arnold's behavior on stage in terms that left no ambiguity about how the athletes felt. Boyko, measured and precise in his language, publicly described Arnold's legs as looking like they belonged in a chicken nest. These weren't comments made in the heat of the moment. These were men who had dedicated years of their lives to standing on that stage in peak condition, watching someone who had walked in off the street 48 hours ago receive the biggest prize in the sport. Backstage, Frank Zane accepted his third-place trophy. Still coated in oil from the stage, he set it down and put on his warm-up suit. When he picked it up again, it slipped from his hands, hit the floor, and broke apart. He looked down at it, picked up the nameplate that read Mr. Olympia 1980 third place, and walked out to the back of the building. Some accounts say he threw it at the wall. Zane has said the fall was an accident. Either way, a man who had won the title 3 consecutive years was standing alone backstage, holding a piece of broken hardware after one of the most disillusioning nights of his career. The more consequential fallout came from CBS. The network had invested significantly in traveling to Sydney with a full production crew, as part of a 3-year deal to broadcast the Mr. Olympia, an arrangement intended to bring professional bodybuilding into mainstream American television. When the CBS crew returned to the United States, they refused to air the footage. Not delayed it. Not edited it. Refused. Network executives reviewed what had been filmed and concluded that the competition had been decided in Arnold's favor through corrupt judging. They were sufficiently confident in that conclusion that they showed the footage directly to Chris Dickerson, the man who had finished second, as evidence of what they had observed. The television news magazine 60 Minutes began looking into the contest as a potential story. The fact that a program of that stature was examining judging practices in professional bodybuilding indicates the scale of the fallout from that night. The 1980 Mr. Olympia was never officially broadcast. It remains to this day the most disputed result in the history of the sport. What followed in the weeks and months after the contest was, in many respects, more consequential than the contest itself. The result didn't simply anger competitors, it undermined the credibility of the sport's central institution. Frank Zane, Boyko, Mike Mensa, and Roger Walker all reached the same decision. They would not compete in the 1981 Mr. Olympia. The boycott was not impulsive. These were men who had built their careers around the sport and understood precisely what they were walking away from. They chose to do so because competing felt like endorsing a result they regarded as illegitimate. For Zane, whose sense of integrity had always been a defining characteristic, returning to a system that had publicly demonstrated merit was secondary to politics was not something he was willing to do. Mike Mensa never competed again. Not just the 1981 Olympia, he never stepped on a bodybuilding stage again for the rest of his life. The man who had spent years developing what he believed was the most scientifically rigorous training philosophy in the sport, who had arrived in Sydney in arguably the best condition of any competitor on that stage, had placed fifth. He didn't see it as a defeat. He saw it as a verdict on the sport itself. That a rational system built on merit and excellence could be overridden by relationships, power, and money. He walked away not in bitterness but on principle. He'd rather be outside a corrupt system than inside it. The 1981 Mr. Olympia, still promoted by Arnold and his business partner Jim Lorimer, handed the title to Franco Columbu, one of Arnold's closest friends and longtime training partner, who was returning from a serious leg injury that had left him with visible asymmetry. CBS once again declined to air it. Back-to-back Olympias with results the network considered too compromised to broadcast. Fans began questioning the sport's credibility, which had been carefully built over decades. The gap between what audiences could see with their own eyes and what the judges were scoring had become difficult to ignore. People who had been devoted followers of professional bodybuilding started to wonder whether what they were watching was a competition or something else entirely. Frank Zane, now 83, is careful with his words. He has always been more measured than most in professional sports, and that hasn't changed with age. In public interviews, he describes Arnold as a friend. He says neither of them was at his absolute best in 1980. He is diplomatic and gracious, qualities some interpret as forgiveness and others as restraint. His written account on his own website, frankzane.com, offers a fuller record. In his own words, Arnold didn't deserve to win in 1980. And he goes further. Franco Columbu didn't deserve to win in 1981 either. 2 years in a row where the result, in his view, was wrong. 2 years in a row where the sport's most prestigious title went to someone in Arnold's orbit while the most deserving athletes on stage went home empty-handed. He describes the night in specific detail. The meeting where Arnold pushed for format changes, the atmosphere of stress and suspicion, standing in the lineup and already sensing as names were called in reverse order what the outcome would be. Hearing his name called third. Hearing sustained booing from the crowd and thinking to himself that the audience had good taste. Walking backstage, the trophy coming apart in his oiled hands, taking only the nameplate and walking out the back while Arnold, still on stage, told the booing crowd that this proved once and for all he was the greatest bodybuilder of all time. Zane found his wife Christine at the back of the auditorium. They walked out together. There was a party. They didn't go. They returned to their hotel. He had a couple of glasses of wine and he went to sleep. The next day they went to a barbecue on the beach. He asked for the strongest beer they had. He drank it. And in his own words, written with a plainness that carries its own weight, the booze couldn't erase what had happened from my mind. That is what 44 years of silence sounds like when it finally breaks.